Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to take some time to share some of the findings from research that me and colleagues here at the Partnership for Work Health and Safety, including Chris McLeod and Mika Kuhorn and Barb Neese, have done on different types of workers than seafarers, more specifically looking at interjurisdictional workers, so workers who are injured in a province through work-related injury, file a claim there, but are actually resident in other provinces in Canada. And how do their work disability outcomes compare to those who are injured and reside in the same province? And whether these differences vary by industry and jurisdictional context. So I'll just note that this work is actually, earlier versions of this work were presented back in May 2019, but we've advanced things a bit since then, and we actually published this study earlier this year in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And to give a bit of context as to why we're actually looking at these types of workers, there's different reasons as to why we should be looking at them. And firstly, we can think of the challenges that injured workers that are interjurisdictionally mobile pose to their employers and also the workers' compensation boards. They can raise a question in terms of who's responsible for them, and challenges in terms of how do you accommodate them, because how are you expecting a worker to return to work if they're traveling large distances from one side of Canada to the other, or maybe it's less severe and they're just traveling between bordering provinces. And within the actual workers' compensation system, they pose problems in terms of how do you actually track them in the data? They could present a potentially vulnerable group, because on the one hand, they may be making great sacrifices, traveling far from home, far from their family to seek employment opportunities. But on the other hand, they also represent these people who could be highly paid, highly skilled workers too. In any case, there's really a kind of lack of research on these types of workers in terms of their work disability and return to work outcomes. Barb mentioned earlier the work that Nicola Cherry has done, and it's true there's not really been much quantitative work done on interjurisdictional workers. Here I mentioned like three particular studies which were helpful for when we were doing our research. And the first of these was conducted by researchers, which was part of the former Liberty Mutual Research Institute in the United States. And their study was actually primarily focused on looking at the state level policies and practices which can influence disability and costs of low back paying claims within a private healthcare insurance system. But interestingly, within that study, they had a measure of whether the worker was residing and claiming in the same province versus those that were not. And they found that of their cohort, about 6% of them didn't live and work in the same state as those that did. And in general, they had about 3.6 days of disability longer than their within state counterparts, after controlling for a variety of different state level and individual characteristics. The most developed research on this topic has been from Nicola Cherry and her colleagues at the University of Alberta. And this work has been published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine with two separate studies. The first study primarily focusing on the injury incidence rate and acceptance of claims of out-of-province residents, particularly from Newfoundland and Labrador relative to Alberta residents. And that first study found that they had lower odds of having accepted claims, not just in terms of no time loss claims, but different types of time loss claims, even after adjusting for characteristics such as your age, sex, industry, and injury. And in a follow-up study, they looked specifically at the length of disability of workers from Atlantic Canada who were working and injured in Alberta, relative to those who were residents in Alberta. And before accounting for other characteristics, they were about 50% less likely to exit wage replacement benefits than the Alberta resident counterparts. However, the differences were attenuated after you start adjusting for other characteristics, in particular when they control for whether the worker received treatment in the place of residence outside of Alberta. But this research has been limited, so firstly, you've got private healthcare insurance setting in the United States focusing on one particular type of injury. And then you've got research done just in one province with a type of interjurisdictional worker which is traveling very far from another part of Canada. So just to get a bit of perspective on interjurisdictional workers, this slide is essentially showing the proportion of them relative to others in the province. So using the Canadian employer-employee dynamics database data, which is based on tax returns. So you can see here that Alberta and Saskatchewan tend to have the highest proportions of these interjurisdictional workers relative to other provinces in Canada, and that these percentages do change over time. They fluctuate often in relation to the fluctuations in the business cycle. Thinking about the workers' compensation system, all the territorial and provincial workers' compensation boards have signed an agreement to act together in assisting employees and employers who perform work in more than one jurisdiction. And the three main benefits of this are that employers shouldn't have to pay assessments twice for the same payroll, that workers and firms in interjurisdictional trucking shouldn't have to pay assessments in every province or territory that they travel through or in, and then also that workers may receive services in their own province or territory even if they're injured or filed a claim elsewhere. So it's also important to note at this point that in the majority of cases, when an interjurisdictional worker, in the majority of cases, interjurisdictional workers claim compensation benefits in the province in which they're injured. But in some smaller cases, they may elect to claim compensation in their home province. In instances where that's possible is usually where the employer is registered with Compensation Board in multiple provinces because they're conducting work in both provinces. So we have a great opportunity to actually investigate these types of workers because we were already doing a large comparative study of return to work across 6 jurisdictions in Canada, which are highlighted here in green, which allows us to capture claims from up to about 70% of the workforce eligible for compulsory coverage and compensation. And the two main objectives of our study were firstly to examine whether out-of-province workers have longer disability duration than their within-province counterparts, and secondly, whether the effect of being an out-of-province worker varies by industry sector and jurisdiction, so province in which the claim was filed. So to do this, we used workers' compensation data from these 6 provinces. That included claim level data, payment level data, and employer level data. Importantly, we had access to the 6-digit residential postal code of the workers. So this allowed us to actually code each injured worker to the province in which they were living, as well as having information from the jurisdiction of the claim. And we created comparable cohorts of injured workers based on the following criteria of them having at least 1 day of disability paid. They had to be aged between 15 and 80 at the time of injury, have an accepted work-related injury or musculoskeletal disorder claim that happened between 2006 and 2015. And then other restrictions we applied was we wanted the cohort to have non-missing sex, age, injury, occupation, industry, and their province of residence. So altogether, this gave us a really large cohort of about 1.6 million claims over a 10-year period. And our two key variables are firstly, how do we distinguish between out-of-province and within-province claims? So out-of-province claims are those which have filed a claim in one province, have a residential address in the other province. Whereas within-province claims are where workers file a claim and have a residential address in the same province. Our outcome measure is cumulative disability days paid. So this is based on wage replacement benefits. And due to differences in work schedules and payments in the systems, some workers may receive fractional days paid. They may be paid out on work patterns based on their work week. So we have to create a standardized measure based on full work days and on a 5-day work week. And for every claim, we allow them to have up to 1 year follow-up. So 260 days, at which point we kind of cap the days paid. There's large differences between out-of-province and within-province workers, which I'll show you in following slides. But In order to make a kind of fair comparison in the disability duration between these two groups of workers, we conducted an exact matching strategy. So for every out-of-province worker, we matched them on a one-to-one basis with a comparable within-province worker with the same sex, age group, injury type, earnings, occupational industry coding, as well as their firm size and the province of their claim. And we use a quantile regression model to model the actual disability duration. And the benefits of this is that it can account for the highly skewed nature of the cumulative days paid measure and allow us to estimate differences at different points in the distribution. So imagine it being like short, medium, long, and very long claims. So claims at the 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles of the distribution. And we're able to adjust for the variables that are included in the match, as well as additional variables which we didn't include in the matching of the claims. And we conducted separate models based on industry, province, as well as sensitivity analysis by sex and injury type. So this map is just to show you that overall, we actually have higher proportions of interjurisdictional workers within the province of Alberta, which kind of corresponds with what we're seeing with Statistics Canada data. About 4% of the claims. And it was that province that also had the largest absolute number of claims. There was about 11,000 out-of-province claims there as well. In contrast to provinces like BC, where it's only about 1% of the actual claims. In terms of the kind of differences prior to matching, you can see that in general, out-of-province workers tend to have a higher proportion of male workers. They tend to have a younger age distribution too. Over time, there's been a slight decline in terms of the proportion of out-of-province claims per year. And then these workers tend to have sort of similar distribution, but you see large proportions of fracture-related injuries. Where we see really big differences, which really emphasizes the importance of the match, is in terms of their job characteristics, so the occupation they work in and the industry as well. So actually, like just over 50% of the out-of-province workers were in trades, transport, and equipment operation occupations. In contrast, only about 35% for within province. And in an industry, you also see a quarter of the cohort are in the construction sector, followed by other sectors such as transportation and warehousing, manufacturing, mining, oil and gas, and public administration. So for our sector-specific analysis, we actually focus in on those 5 sectors. After we do our matching, you can see that we actually retain a high proportion of our out-of-province workers, so over 90% overall, and over 90% in each of the provinces, with the exception of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. And because I have a lot of figures coming up, I thought it would be useful for you just to have the kind of key findings out there ahead of time, and that is that work disability duration is significantly longer for out-of-province workers, even after matching and adjusting on observable characteristics. However, differences between these workers do vary by industry and jurisdiction. The largest differences we observed were in the construction sector and the transportation and warehousing sector, as well as mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction. And the largest differences were also observed in the Western provinces, and that is largely going to be related to the fact that in those provinces they have high proportion of work in those sectors and rely heavily upon out-of-jurisdiction workers in those sectors. And then in our sensitivity analysis, we also found that there was larger differences observed among the male-only cohort compared to the female-only cohort, and then we actually saw larger differences in fracture-related claims than back soft tissue injuries. So this is, this is a result for the main overall model, using the predictions from the fully adjusted match model, quantile regression. So on the vertical axis, you've got the predicted disability days paid. If you remember, a full year would be equivalent to 260 days. And across the horizontal axis, we have different percentiles in the distribution. So you could, simple way of thinking of this is that this would be short duration claims. This is like the median or the middle of the distribution. This is longer claims and very long claims. And we have the predicted values for out-of-province and within-province workers, holding all other characteristics at their mean values. And basically what you see here is that the further up the distribution you go, you start to see greater differences in the disability days paid to these workers. So out-of-province workers are on average paid 1 day more in the 25th percentile. This expands to actually a week more of disability, so about a month more, and then 2 to 3 months more at the tail end of the distribution. And if you're thinking of that in terms of relative differences, that's equivalent to about 35% increase between these two, 46% increase, 50% increase, and about 47% increase. When we start to look at it across sectors, the scale is kept the same as before, and we can actually see that there's a steeper gradient here in terms of the days paid are higher in construction, which is unsurprising, but the actual differences between the two groups is also increasing as well. So instead of 1 day, we actually have about 3 days difference, about 2.5 weeks, 2 months, and actually up to 3 months difference in disability. So 3 months more of disability paid to an injured out-of-province worker in the 90th percentile compared to in-province worker in the 90th percentile. See similar findings for transportation and warehousing, not quite as high disability, but similar differences, with a bigger difference at the 25th percentile, a week more disability here, 2 weeks more, about a month and a half and 3 months again. Mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction sector, the two sort of notable differences here is that the actual values at the 25th percentile are much higher, and but we don't see that great a difference between them. And then we also see wider confidence intervals here, indicating that there's less precision in these estimates, and perhaps less of not necessarily a statistically significant difference between within and out of province workers in this sector. Here we have manufacturing. You can really see that the actual gradient is compressed a lot more. There's not really large differences between the groups, perhaps except with the exception of the 90th percentile. So it's only about 1 week, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and about 2.5 months. And then in public administration, you really see very little difference. You only have like a day difference here, 4 days here, and about 3 weeks here. And the types of industry sectors that out-of-province workers work in varied across the jurisdictions. And a lot of the public administration claims were actually in Ontario. So that's perhaps driven by the sort of cross-border migration between the, or cross-border commuting between Ottawa and Gatineau. So in order to create a more kind of fair comparison between the provinces, what we did is we excluded claims in this sector for our province-specific models. And so here in BC, and as you'll see in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, we see very similar results to what we were seeing within the construction and transportation. And that's going to be driven by the fact that a lot of these workers are working in those sectors there. But you have a difference of about 2 days, a couple of weeks, a month and a half, and 3 months. So it's, as I said, it's similar as what we saw before. Similar again, just under a week, 3 weeks, about a month and a half to about 3 to 4 months this time. So there's a big difference here in the 90th percentile in Alberta. And similar in Saskatchewan and also in Manitoba. Whereas in contrast in Ontario, even after we excluded those public administration claims, we really don't see the same degree of difference between out of province and within province workers. So there's only a difference of 1 day at the 25th percentile, 2 days at the 50th percentile, about 1 week at the 75th percentile, and only about 4 days at the 90th percentile. Whereas earlier we're seeing differences of about 3 months at this point. And then the last result slide is for New Brunswick. And we see a sort of greater degree of disability paid out. And we see greater difference in the claims here relative to Ontario, but it's not as great as what we were seeing in Western Canada. So there's important sort of strengths and limitations of the study which need to be mentioned, as well as the implications, which I'll get to on the next slide. But to our knowledge, this is the largest study on the disability duration of interjurisdictional workers. And because of the scale and scope of the study, we're actually able to capture different types of interjurisdictional workers beyond those which were captured in the work in the United States and the work that Nicola Cherry has done. And because we use a quantile regression model, we're actually able to look at differences between the two groups at different points in the disability distribution. And that's important because we can see that these differences tend to be much greater for long duration claims than short duration claims. However, we need to acknowledge that there's limitations in the data we use and the methods we use, the measures we use. Firstly, in terms of our outcome measure, we rely on cumulative disability days paid. And this really only acts as a kind of proxy for return to work, because we follow workers when they're paid wage replacement benefits, but they could be transitioning off to other types of benefit payments, perhaps through vocational rehabilitation, or they may be transitioning off benefits altogether and going outside of the labour market. And that's something we can't account for working only with workers' compensation data. We also don't have any measures of kind of severity. We have nature of injury codes and part of body codes based on our injury diagnoses. And we also did the sensitivity analysis of fracture claims that still found differences, but it would be better if you could link in other health information to actually look at healthcare services to maybe try and create some kind of severity measure and see whether accounting for that removes any of the remaining difference between the two groups of workers. The work in Alberta by Nicola Cherry was able to actually account for whether they received treatment in their province of residence as opposed to the province of the injury, and that removed any differences. But unfortunately, we don't have a comparable measure of that across all 6 of our compensation board's data. And the last major limitation would be regarding the residential postal code. So we rely on residential postal code to identify where the worker lives. However, it's possible that workers may change location over time, and we are not able to account for that in our analyses. It's also important to think about the distances that workers may be traveling between their place of work and place of residence. And that's something that we don't investigate in this study, but hope to do so in future research. Bearing in mind these limitations, there's several important implications from our study. Firstly is that we provide evidence that out-of-province workers experience long work disability durations even after accounting for observable characteristics. And so even though these workers may only account for about, at most, 4% of claims in some jurisdictions and as little as 1% in some jurisdictions, there are large differences, particularly for the long duration claims, which can account for a lot of costs in terms of disability benefits and medical costs to the compensation boards and employers, but also a severe burden to the workers and their families as well. Workers' compensation systems and employers and healthcare providers may need to tailor specific interventions for these types of workers. Like a common intervention for disability and for return to work is to provide work accommodation, or in other words, like modified return to work opportunities through reduced hours, alternate duties, or modified duties. However, it's very challenging to actually provide appropriate work accommodation in these sectors which these workers tend to concentrate in, let alone taking into account the fact that they might be traveling quite far from out of province to do this work. So in some cases, the light duties that they're offered may be quite unrelated to their actual pre-injury job. There's additional travel time away from family, recovery, which may make it very difficult and lead to other kind of social and financial hardships for those workers. If you think back to those of you who may have attended the last webinar, Dana House presented some really interesting research looking at how work-related travel is often taken for granted by the employers and compensation boards and not adequately accounted for in terms of policy and practice for injured workers. So that's particularly relevant here for these interjurisdictional workers. And then, although this study was almost 5 years before it took place for a study period, almost 5 years before the current COVID-19 pandemic, it is important to think about how these workers are often considered as essential. It raises a challenge of how you keep these workers safe during the COVID-19 pandemic, reduce their exposure to COVID-19, and then how do you actually accommodate them? The additional challenges that poses if they have a work-related injury. Are they going to have access to relevant healthcare services, how are they going to be able to successfully have work accommodation, particularly when you have to take into account the fact that they may be experiencing periods of quarantine as well if they're traveling between jurisdictions. And there's lots of different avenues of future research to go from here. However, we're fortunate because as part of this large SSHRC CHR partnership grant, we will be conducting more work on this, particularly on mobile workers more broadly in the province of BC. So for that, we will be making use of additional types of data held within the WorkSafe BC data, as well as the data from the Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamics database, which I showed you some figures from earlier before. So that's going to allow us to actually do some almost like replication of the work in Alberta to look at whether the rate of injuries or rate of claims being accepted within the province differs for workers who are actually working in BC versus those that are not. And it will also be looking at different measures of return to work and taking into account location information of the residents, the employer mail address, as well as operating locations, try and tease apart some of these differences which may occur in the travel between place of work and residence, to look at intra and interjurisdictional workers in BC and return to work, not only in terms of disability days paid, but also as sustainable return to work, whether it's with the same employer or a different employer. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge that this was part of a larger comparative study, which included co-investigators of Ben Amick, Sheila Hogg-Johnson, Peter Smith, and Alex Colley. And the initial funding for that was through a CHR operating grant, whereas the new work we've been doing is part of this SSHRC CHR partnership grant. We thank the data stewards from the 6 workers' compensation boards, and also want to note that all inferences, opinions, and conclusions drawn in this presentation are those of ours and not those of the data stewards. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing on any of your questions.